Chapter 17 Finally, Medevacs. Well, it's finally over for me, anyway. Lance Corporal Cromwell, radioman to the XO, B-19, had thought upon being ushered south on Route 561 well in advance of the withdrawing column. He had made no great strides in rejoining Lieutenant Delaney on the strip, such was the heat and the burden of his radio, when the first mortar barrage began around the tanks far to his rear. Cromwell beat it to a roadside hole, then was shocked to see mid-air explosions that showered their shrapnel down like darts and eliminated the cover offered by holes and ditches. The airbursts were directly above Route 561, and they were a terrible surprise for Cromwell, who had the understanding that the NVA did not have such sophisticated ammunition. "This is the last straw, they can't do much more to us." During the first lull, Cromwell moved out again, finally finding Lieutenant Delaney. They moved on into Delta 3's perimeter, Cromwell much relieved to see that Delaney was all right, not only because he liked the man but because, having survived a scrap or two together, he considered the lieutenant a good luck charm. He didn't want to lose Delaney until he knew they were out of this mess. Lieutenant Delaney and Lance Corporal Cromwell tried to bring some order to the chaos that existed within Delta 3's relatively leaderless lines. They began having the wounded moved to the center of the perimeter for better control and for the administrative work of getting their names, ranks, service numbers, etc., which Cromwell relayed to battalion, even as Delaney borrowed the radio at intervals to update Con-Tien on their situation and to request medevacs. As they worked, Cromwell made sure he had a handy hole nearby. After 20 minutes, by which time he was carrying all their radios to that hole to control the medevacs that were presently airborne and inbound, the NVA artillery began shrieking in. The first shell exploded 30 feet to Cromwell's front, and he made a screeching dive the last 6 feet to the hole onto Delaney, who was already in it. The first round had landed in the middle of their position, as did every one of the next 130 rounds that Delaney counted from the bottom of their hole. The whole experience was a frightening example of the enemy's artillery skill, made even more personal when one round landed so close that the edge of its crater was only 3 feet from the edge of their hole. Delaney and Cromwell were slammed and bounced by the roaring impact of that one, with the wind knocked out of them, and Cromwell left with a throbbing concussion headache. When the shelling lifted, helmeted heads popped up like moles to find that 2 Marines too seriously wounded to crawl to cover had been blown to bits. The medevacs broke off, and the decision was spontaneously made to move the wounded to a new LZ on the southern side of the strip. In addition to possibly being out of sight of the NVA artillery spotters, this would also force the next NVA ground assault, which they all knew was coming, to cross the vulnerably open strip to reach the wounded. As for the twice-shot PFC Weldon, he had found a little hole for himself, and had yet to be treated by a corpsman, when a Marine stopped near his group, motioned south across the strip, then pointed at Weldon and a few others. You. If you can make it back, make it back on your own. If you need help, just let us know." About this time, approximately 1500, Lieutenant Colonel Skeening, CO. 19, alerted Colonel Giroux, CO. 9th Marines, that all his companies were engaged and that he had no more unites to commit. Colonel Giroux responded that the area's ready reserve, 3-9 in Dong Ha, would be flown into the strip to the aid of 1-9. Meanwhile, Skeening ordered Major Danielson, XO. 19, to organize a rescue force to meet those 50 or so figures, which they at Con-Tien could see coming across the strip. They were not in radio contact with this group, nor with Delta 3, and only intermittently with Bravo Company, but that the group included wounded and needed help was obvious. Danielson rounded up 3 vehicles, a USMC Jeep ambulance and a USA Jeep and truck from the base's Special Forces Detachment, aboard which came some USN volunteers from the CB detachment, and they soon departed Con-Tien. Captain Radcliffe and Staff Sergeant Burns finally reached Delta 3's perimeter with the bulk of Bravo Company. Utter goddamn chaos. Radcliffe thought a malaise had affected people who were just lying around that LZ there stunned, numb. Before turning to rush back up Route 561 to ensure that no one had been left behind, he grabbed Burns to command hoarsely, "Burns, get out there with Howell, and let's get the goddamn people out of here as quick as we can." Get some kind of priority going. Just get the hell out of here. Don't try to fill out casualty evacuation cards, just get on the damned helicopters and get out of here as best you can. By the time Radcliffe got back half jogging and half staggering, a seahorse was over the hasty LZ that Staff Sergeant Burns and Sergeant Huff had organized. Radcliffe, bloody and sweat-soaked, dusty and exhausted, stood in the LZ and directed the helicopter in for a landing with hand and arm signals, something he had never done before. The crew chief in the open side door held up 4 fingers to indicate the number of wounded they could carry, but Radcliffe could see at least 6 seriously wounded Marines lying there. Take all their goddamn gear off. Some of the wounded already had flak jackets that were half blown off, and with the rest of their accoutrements stripped away, 6 men were lifted aboard the Seahorse. The helo hovered and hovered. Radcliffe wasn't sure it was going to make it, and then away it went. Casualties from Bravo Company never seemed to stop coming, and Doc Lindenmeyer of Delta 3 simply treated one Marine right after another. It seemed there were 60 of them within view. Bare-chested under his flak jacket and looking out from under his helmet brim with regular Coke bottles for eyeglasses, Lindenmeyer had started this exercise with a bulging Unit 1 hanging from his left shoulder to his right hip. It contained a small surgical kit, battle dressings, and 1 unit of serum albumin, a blood volume expander in a 50 cubic centimeters bottle with a needle-tipped rubber tube, all of it in a soda can-sized container. 4 more units were taped to the medical bag's shoulder strap, while a 6th was in his pack. 5 syrettes of morphine, each a sort of small toothpaste tube with a hypodermic needle at the end, were kept in a plastic vial in his pocket. 4 canteens were on his web belt, a 5th was in his pack, along with the standard individual battle dressing pouch over his ass, and a K-bar and a Colt .45 on his hip, which he never fired in anger but whose presence gave him some comfort. Now, Lindenmeyer was out of almost everything, including serum albumin, which he'd ceased using for the reason it had been issued. Its effectiveness relies on drawing excess water from body fluids into the circulating system, a method which relies on the availability of water from these fluids. In that heat there was simply no excess fluids in a man's system. We started serum albumin simply to have N4 going when the casualty got to the field hospital, because if he went into shock his veins collapsed. It was virtually impossible then to start N4. Mostly Lindenmeyer was dealing with shrapnel wounds, but the rain of incoming mortar and artillery rounds did blow both legs off a man he had previously treated for wounds in both arms. The trauma of the blast had sealed the blood vessels, so there was no excessive bleeding. But Lindenmeyer patted the stumps anyway with battle dressings. There was nothing else he could do. He was completely out of serum albumin at this point, so he gave the mangled kid some salt tablets and a gulp of canteen water, hoping that would be enough. But, of course, it wasn't. The Marine looked up. "Hey, Doc." Lindenmeyer bent back over the man, thinking he was going to ask for another syrette of morphine. "Hold my hand." Lindenmeyer held both of the Marine's hands in his like he was a brother, like I was his mother, and felt the weight of the world on him. The man went into shock. In minutes he was dead. Lindenmeyer stood back up, covered with the dead man's blood, then, because he had no other choice, moved on quickly to another of his casualties. His casualties. Lindenmeyer had wanted none of this. He was no volunteer. The Marine said that USMC meant Uncle Sam's misguided children of unlimited shit and mass confusion, but Lindenmeyer knew that to U.S. Navy personnel like himself, USMC really stood for "You're shittin' me, Chief?" That was the proper response of a hospital corpsman to his chief petty officer upon receiving the sobering surprise that his Vietnam tour was not going to be in the air-conditioned sick bay of a ship offshore, but with ground forces, FMF Pacific. The Fleet Marine Force. The grunts. Hell. Lindenmeyer had joined the Navy to get medical training that might serve him after discharge, and then only because he had flunked out of college during his 3rd year. The only thing that helped him after field medical school and his assignment to D-19 was that the man he was replacing, Doc Speaks, stayed in the bush 3 days to ease his arrival. Among other things, Speaks told Lindenmeyer that the Marines would watch him, and as soon as he demonstrated that he could and would perform under fire, they would accept and protect him. The corpsmen take care of the grunts and the grunts take care of he corpsmen, and that's the way of it. During Lindenmeyer's first contact, he knew that he could not hesitate one instant, and by God, he found himself running up under fire and helping drag a wounded man out of harm's way. Thus a real person to the grunts. They call me Doc, Lindenmeyer wrote home. It makes me feel kind of good, like I'm supposed to be something. Doc Lindenmeyer found that corpsmen, usually a bit older and more mature than their comrades, had a favored status in a line platoon. I was the father confessor, I was the priest, I was the guy everybody went to for advice. Guys would come to me and say, "Hey, look, I joined the Marines to get away from my pregnant girlfriend, and she still wants to have the baby and, you know, what should I do? Should I marry her? What do you say to an 18-year-old kid who's in a situation like that?" I sure as hell didn't know what to say. I did the best I could, but I began to understand what it is that a minister does in society, and it has perhaps less to do with religion and more to do with just being the detached observer who can perhaps offer some sage advice, with a certain moral and ethical credibility to it. After all, Doc Lindenmeyer was 22 years old and had a wife back in the world. Additionally, along with the Sirashan spoon in his flak jacket pocket, he had a pipe, an appropriate prop for the old man of the third herd of dying Delta 19. During the next bout of incoming along the strip, Lindenmeyer lay beside the man he had just treated until crash. A huge explosion lifted them both up and threw them back down. Lindenmeyer squirmed against the earth, head down until the next lull. He called to the man he'd been treating. No answer. Thinking the man must be dead, Lindenmeyer moved to him. There was a pulse and dead. Lindenmeyer moved to him. There was a pulse and shallow breathing, and in a few minutes the grunt opened his eyes and seemed okay. A call then came that a man in their own Delta platoon needed attention. The Marine sat staring off into space, unresponsive to his name or to a slap in the face. Lindenmeyer flashed then to field medical school. An instructor had been asked to describe the symptoms of shell shock and his seemingly unhelpful answer had been that you'd know it when you saw it. Well, he was right. Other Marines were nearby, talking quietly, and Lindenmeyer heard the words, faking it. He pulled the casualty tag book from his Unit 1 and barked, "This man's a casualty. Take him to the center of the perimeter with the rest." The official nature of the tag, which Lindenmeyer then filled out and attached to the Marine's flak jacket, seemed to end the muttering. Lindenmeyer shoved off to find Lieutenant Turchin's radio man, whom he greeted with, "Where are those fucking choppers? All my emergency medevacs are dead, all my priorities are now emergencies. Doc, we got some casualties on a chopper just before that last barrage. Didn't you know?" "No." "Well, get some more choppers in. I still have men who need evacuating." "Okay, I'll try." "Where's the lieutenant?" "He got on the chopper with the casualties." "Was he wounded?" "Just a little ding in the arm. He got hit while walking around inspecting the perimeter during incoming." "Serves him right." Then Lindenmeyer reconsidered, who the fuck authorized him to go? "I have seriously wounded men who should have been on that bird. Doc Shade let him on the chopper. Besides, we're better off without the dumb Sinovovich." Doc Shade was yelling. Lindenmeyer rushed over to find Shade working on Staff Sergeant Miller, who was in great pain and coughing blood from a wound in his left lung. Lindenmeyer rolled the man onto his left side to keep his right lung clear of blood, and Miller shrieked in even greater pain at the move. Doc Shade was a fine corpsman, but he was also close to Miller and was getting frantic. "Give him some morphine." "I'm out of it." Morphine depresses the breathing and is counter-indicated for a lung wound, but Lindenmeyer didn't want to contradict Shade in front of Miller or the other grunts within hearing distance. That might adversely affect their confidence in Shade and, since much of their field medicine was psychological, his effectiveness. Lindenmeyer had one cigarette left, but he said, "I'm sorry, I'm out of it too." Doc Shade had no way of knowing what his partner had or didn't have, but he screamed, "You are not. You just hate him. Doc Shade was close to Lindenmeyer's feelings about their good but, in Lindenmeyer's view, overly gung-ho platoon sergeant. That, however, had nothing to do with his withholding morphine. He couldn't think of anything to say back, so without saying anything he turned and walked back to the casualties in the center of the perimeter. 10 minutes later, Staff Sergeant Miller was dead and Lindenmeyer doubted himself. Maybe he should have given him the morphine to make his last few minutes easier. But, no, he had no right to waste it on a dying man when there was an abundant supply of other Marines in pain whom the morphine might keep alive by keeping them out of shock. Lindenmeyer had never before felt so mixed up, but he also incredibly lucky. During the afternoon, 6 of his fellow corpsmen were killed and another 6 were wounded. The Marines of Bravo Company, and their attached Alpha Platoon, immediately went for the holes upon reaching the strip. But working parties were needed to get the casualties to the southern side of the 600-meter-wide clearing, so they were up and moving again. It was slow and painstaking. PFC Hendry, for one, started south on his own, but his wounded leg was like a plank. He was getting nowhere before 6 Marines scooped his naked ass up in a poncho. They trudged their way south, weaving toward any low spots into which they could flatten in case of more incoming, and when they finally bumped into Staff Sergeant Burns in the new, hasty LZ, Hendry grinned at his favorite NCO that this was his ticket home. Hendry rattled on with some other wounded buddies, then his nervous, twisted, and empty guts finally vomited up the warm soda given to him by the Charlie Company grunt. Captain Radcliffe and Staff Sergeant Burns, meanwhile, got their people spread out to secure the area, and it was then that Major Danielson arrived from Con Tien with his Jeep ambulance, and 6 by truck. Danielson climbed wide-eyed from his Jeep. The situation was worse than had been interpreted at the CP. Marines wandered about in shock, wounded men lay in the dirt on the verge of bleeding to death, and everyone, even those up and moving, seemed to have at least one bloody, dirty battle dressing. Major Danielson was ready to help, but his presence was mostly brushed aside by the tatterdemalion Marines rushing about him. His courage became a victim of the attitude expressed by Captain Radcliffe about their less exposed superiors. I wasn't disrespectful to him, but I didn't have time to fuck around with him. The most seriously wounded were placed aboard the vehicles, but no sooner had that been completed than a pair of CH-46C Knights arrived overhead. Major Danielson was surprised to see them for they were, after all, relatively slow-moving hellos, and any medevac attempt considering the potential for enemy artillery on the new landing zone would put pilots and crews in great jeopardy. The seriously wounded were taken off the vehicles as first one and then the other C Knights settled down, with lowered back ramps, and in a wind-blasted hustle they were transferred aboard. The process slowed down then as Major Danielson noted. The pilots and crew chiefs of the helicopters signaled to me that they were overloaded and would not be able to take off. As a result, I took it upon myself to make instantaneous selections of those Marines, some of whom were in shock I'm sure, who appeared to be the least seriously wounded and order them off the helicopters. Not a pleasant job, but one I thought necessary under the circumstances. In the heat of the moment, PFC Hendry, who had just been carried from the back of the Jeep ambulance to one of the helicopters, a change he thanked God for, was going crazy. Playing games, he thought again, having no understanding why men who'd been carried on were now being carried off. Wasting time. He knew that the NVA would take this lingering target under fire, and sure enough, in the 4 or 5 agonizing minutes the big C Knight sat, vibrating on the ground, artillery rounds did begin impacting near the LZ, just a bit off target. When Major Danielson completed his task and so signaled the pilots, the C Knights climbed through the artillery fire, taking away to safety PFC Weldon who'd been twice shot, captured and recovered, and then blown off a mine tank, and approximately 35 other seriously wounded Marines. First stop for them was Dong Ha. It was about 1600. The only seriously wounded man in the medical bunker, which was cut into the southern slope of the western Con Tien Hill, with 13 layers of sandbags along its 3 walls, and a roof of 28 layers, was Sergeant Guiser of Alpha Company. He lay on his back on a stretcher across 2 sawhorses, as the battalion's Navy doctor used long surgical scissors to cut along the seam of his flak jacket zipper. This done, the doctor peeled off the ragged, bloody body armor to examine Guizer's gut-to-back wound. He had, by then, a stream of blood running down his chest to his crotch from his other wound, the ding in his head, that had congealed into a ridge 3/4 of an inch thick. Because morphine could mask the seriousness of head wounds, the doctor would administer nothing for the pain, which was in an ebb and flow cycle at this point. And because of the potential of a stomach injury, water was also not allowed. When the doctor moved on, though, Guizer called out for water, and a corpseman handed him a little, in a canteen cup. He dropped the emptied cup under the sawhorse and asked the next corpseman who came by for a drink, pretending never to have gotten the first. Sergeant Guizer's radioman, PFC Ross, appeared at the bunker entrance, but the corpsman would not let him in, and that was the last they ever saw of each other. A tall, blonde lance corporal from the CP did get in. The lance corporal talked to him about how he was doing, then the young man teared up a bit and said he had stood watches with Guizer in the same tent. Guizer recognized the man's face. He had been on the infantry net while Guizer had monitored the artillery net. The lance corporal went on to tell Guizer that he was his role model of what a Marine should be, and that he felt real bad when it came over the radio that he'd been hit. Guizer was very moved. Shortly thereafter, an officer from the CP entered the bunker to consult with the Navy doctor. The helicopters don't want to come in. They feel, Contien's going to get hit, that we're going to get hit anytime. Can the guys wait? The doctor went straight to Guizer and pried open his eyelids. He was, in fact, awake, but the doctor didn't ask, then answered the officer, "Yes, I've got one. I want to get out of here. The others can wait, but I want this one out of here if possible." The officer exited the bunker at a fast pace and returned a bit later to report, "Boy, they're really scared to bring choppers in now. They're afraid they're gonna get clobbered." "Sure you can't keep him?" The doctor pressed the issue. "I'd like to get this one out of here." And again the officer departed, only to reappear moments later. "Well, I wouldn't do it if I was them, but the crazy sons of bitches are going to come in, so get him and anyone else you got down to the LZ." Sergeant Guizer's stretcher was lifted from the sawhorses, and up the sandbag steps he went, looking at the world from his back. Helicopters dotted the sky, including two Hueys that orbited directly above their knob. One would dart in for him and a couple walking wounded, while the other maintained its sky-high watch. When his stretcher carriers crested the hill, Guizer looked down the strip. He could see vehicles in miniature near the southern edge of the strip, and he could see puffs around them from incoming artillery that looked harmless in the distance. When the shelling stopped, the rest of the wounded were again placed on the vehicles. Most had been helped aboard when Lance Corporal Cromwell, for one, heard several horrendous explosions and thought for a moment that it was Marine counter-battery fire, until he glanced skyward and saw the rockets coming down right on top of them. Remembering the wounded men who'd been killed in the first LZ, this time the wounded were hustled back off the truck in jeeps and helped to cover. 3 times they had to load and unload at the behest of the NVA batteries, and it was during one of the shellings that Bravo Company took its last casualty of the day, when one of their lance corporals had 3 artillery rounds land around him simultaneously. The lance corporal survived and was on his feet, but he was too shell-shocked to function. When a lull finally allowed them to get the vehicles crammed with the casualties once and for all, he was among them. Major Danielson then ordered Captain Radcliffe and Staff Sergeant Burns to take what remained of Bravo Company back north across the strip to help those casualties that remained with Delta III, and to beef up the perimeter there in case of further NVA ground attacks. "Take a flying fuck at a rolling donut." The shout had come from one of the bleary-eyed grunts around them, but although Burns had heard it distinctly, Major Danielson either had not or thought it best to ignore it. The order, of course, stood, and with that Danielson got back in his jeep and, as Burns put it with anger and some envy, took off and got the hell out of there. The casualty-laden vehicles headed back for Con-Tien with Major Danielson, and in the artillery-propelled haste to load them, some wounded men had not been evacuated and some healthy men had taken their places. Thinking the vehicles had also come to evacuate Bravo Company, they had not. Lieutenant Delaney went out this way, Corporal Pitts got the survivors of his squad aboard, and Lance Corporal Cull, looking at the confusion around him, thought it best to jump on the back of the truck. As they started off, the army jeep hit a bump that sent flying the GI manning its .50 caliber machine gun. The GI hurt his leg so badly that he couldn't walk, so Lance Corporal Cromwell jumped on the Hun, threw my radio in the jeep, and rode shotgun on a .50 caliber. I'd never fired a .50 caliber before, but I think I could have done a fairly good job if we would have run into anything. Stumbling back across the strip with Radcliffe and Burns's stripped down, platoon-sized Bravo company was Herber's M79 man, face shot and teeth shattered, who had yet to be medevaced. He was shaky. They were all shaky. As the column passed back into Delta 3's perimeter, Doc Lindenmeyer gave an unconcerned glance at a phantom jet roaring above them. The sky is ours until he realized it was diving directly at them. He saw two bombs separate, one from each wing, and he fell to the earth, shrieking, "Incoming!" Wow pomp! Lindenmeyer kneeled to emerge from the covering of fragmented earth. The bombs had showered upon him, then he stood, spitting dirt from his mouth, blowing dirt from his nose, wiping dirt from his eyes and ears. All around him were dirt-shrouded, prostrate human forms, and feeling helplessly alone, he called out, "Is anybody hurt?" No one answered. Then, all the dirt-covered forms began to move. The Phantom's bombs had exploded in the middle of the perimeter, doing nothing worse than shattering eardrums, nerves, and whatever faith these men still had that this day might actually end. Chapter 18 Charlie Company's turn. With the tanks now gone and Charlie Company's rear guard position reduced to a compact, ragged little circle in the marketplace, Captain Hutchinson turned to Lieutenant Labouty and instructed him to get their column moving south again. To Labouty, the word from a captain of Marines was the word from God. So as only a second lieutenant would do, he stood right up to carry out his orders, forgetting about the snipers around them. The company was clustered around him in the elephant grass, all of them prone or kneeling under the occasional fire. Labouty called to them, "Okay, guys, let's go. Get up. We're moving out." No one moved. Labouty crouched back down and changed his tact as he growled at those men within earshot, "Listen, Marines, we're either going to stay here and die or we're going to move out. I tell you to stand up, stand up. We're all moving out of here, God damn it." Labouty stood back up, continuing to encourage the men, and thank God, he thought everyone got to his feet and formed up on the road. Labouty fell in behind the first three men in line, his radioman a few steps behind him. 100 meters down the road, AK-47 fire suddenly cut down those first three men. Labouty and his radioman instantly hit the deck. Behind them, from the sixth man on back, the column disappeared into the roadside hedges and brush. Labouty crawled forward to where his three-point men had rolled on the side of the trail. One man, a big kid, had been shot in the guts and was in bad shape, but the other two, while hurting too bad to pull a trigger, were still coherent. The radioman also crawled up, and as he stripped ammo bandoliers from the most seriously wounded man, Labouty began firing his carbine into the brush ahead to keep their ambushers down, while he figured out how the hell they were going to extricate themselves from this mess. In short order, Labouty's carbine jammed, and as he was wrapping his hands around an M16 dropped by one of the wounded men, he and his radioman suddenly spotted NVA rushing across the trail ahead of them. The NVA were trying to get into better firing positions, and Labouty and the radioman instantly opened fire on them from the side of the road where they had assumed sitting positions like at the rifle range. They put rounds downrange as hot and heavy as they could, pulling fresh magazines from the pouches of the wounded men beside them, talking to them between bursts, trying to calm them as they reloaded even as their own sweat poured as they struggled to remain in control. An occasional NVA or two would suddenly appear, darting from one side of the road to the other, trying to find a position from which best to fire into the stranded group. "Sir, I think I got one." The NVA stopped crossing the road. Everything got quiet. Labouty remained in position, the borrowed M16 pointed down the trail, and when he looked over at the big kid who seemed to be in shock, it suddenly hit him. Holy cow, I got wounded Marines. I gotta do something. Labudi unsnapped his field dressing pouch and tried to wrap the man's gut wound, at least do something to stop the bleeding as his mind raced. Okay, we can't stay here, we gotta run outta here or someone's going to come in and shoot us. He hefted the big kid onto his shoulders, but as soon as he tried to stand up under the near deadweight, over he went. He settled for dragging the man into the brush along the road. Then he rolled back onto the trail, coming up back to back with his radioman, facing south and the radioman facing north to watch the whole circle around them. They hoped the company would get itself together post-haste and come get them. There was no time to wait. The first Chi-Com grenade came over the hedgerow to Labudi's left, and it hit his foot at the same time his radioman yelled a warning. They rolled away, but there was no explosion, a dud, and they wheeled back into their back-to-back position. The next grenade came out of nowhere, hit Labudi in the crotch, and bounced to the ground as they again jumped away and flattened out. Another dud. In the brush to his left, Labudi saw, or afterward he wondered if only his terrified mind's eye saw, an NVA coming through the hedgerow. So with his M16 on automatic, he emptied the magazine into that spot. No more chickums. We have to get out of here, we can't stay in this position. Labudi had no idea what to do. If they stood, they would surely be shot. But they couldn't bring their wounded with them if they crawled. Actually, help was on the way. One of Labudi's old-timers, CPL Mike Bradley, who had extended his tour after a full year in the bush, responded to the initial fusillade by moving off Route 561 with his buddy Dick Boney in an effort to outflank the ambushers. Reaching a bamboo tree line, they were halted there by an AK-47 burst that kicked 8 or so rounds along the top of the earthen embankment. Crouched near a break in the bamboo line, Bradley and Dick were returning fire. They had no idea what was going on, but recoil dust was visible in the brush some 50 to 75 meters away, when, to their absolute amazement, the bamboo line 20 meters to their right front suddenly burst into flames. An NVA with a flamethrower came into view then in the open area between the two bamboo lines. M16 to his shoulder, Bradley quickly sighted on the man, who was looking away from him, and squeezed what remained of his magazine into him, about 10 rounds, including a tracer that ignited the flame tanks. Snap, crackle, pop, Bradley thought, then with a laugh he or Dick said, I know that prick wasn't trying to light my cigar. Back on Route 561, Captain Hutchinson had moved forward, and he shouted at one of their staff sergeants to take some men and recover the stranded point team, they're wounded or something. Bring them in. The staff sergeant did not move. Hutchinson shouted again, until he realized the staff sergeant was frozen with fear. Angry, promising himself that he would court-martial the bastard if they ever got out of this, but with no time to waste on him now, Hutchinson decided to get Labudi himself. Hutchinson signaled 2 or 3 men to follow him and called to the rest crouching there in the brush along the sunken road, cover me, and put a lot of fire out there except where I am. Labudi had just ceased firing after the second dud grenade, when he looked back, and there was Hutchinson with a handful of Marines. Frustrated, exasperated, gulping air, Labudi greeted Hutchinson with, Jesus. What's going on? Hutchinson, taking a deep breath as well, listened to Labudi's quick report. And as the rest of the company moved forward to link up with them, the NVA disappearing at their renewed advance, he pulled out a pack of cigarettes. Labudi, normally a non-smoker, lit one up too. Back at the strip, behind the cover of a large, upturned tree, Lance Corporal Stuckey had just gotten the word that there were NVA running around in USMC uniforms. That's when he saw an Oriental in Marine gear walk up and sit down without a word a few meters away. There were a lot of Marines in the area, and this man didn't seem to be paying much attention to Stuckey's fire team. But Stuckey wasn't so casual. He had his M16 in his lap, and as unobtrusively as he could, hoping not to startle this potential NVA into action, he eased the M16 in the man's direction and thumbed the safety off. Stuckey watched him like a hawk out of the corner of his eye, ready to blow him away, until another Marine around I-type walked over, and said to the Oriental, Hey, Joe, they want us to move up here now. Lieutenant Labouty was on the left side of Route 561, his view to either side blocked by the hedgerows along the flanks of the road. He sat dead on his ass, his knees drawn up to his chest, and one of the 6 radio men leaned back on Labouty's knee, equally exhausted. Captain Hutchinson was across from him on the other side of the road with his other radio man, looking around as they got ready to continue south from this spot where the ambush had just fizzled out. The rest of Charlie Company was spread out behind them in as much of a tactical stance as possible, one column facing outboard on either side of the road, squads and platoons intermingled. Marines with bandaged arms and legs were carrying ponchos, containing those who were more seriously wounded. They were helped by a squad from Alpha 1 that had been sent back from the strip. It was one of these men from Alpha, PFC Horning, watching the road, and Horning called to the squad radio man, PFC Mesa, "Look at the gooks across the road." "Where?" "There they are." Horning and Mesa opened fire. One of the NVA went down and stayed down, but the other jumped back up and bounded into the roadside brush. Almost instantly then, AK-47 fire began from the front, rear, and flanks, and Captain Hutchinson realized that the NVA, who had silently watched Charlie Company's entrance and had probed and harassed their withdrawal, were now massing for the kill. Thinking of Bravo Company, he jumped down beside Labouty, their faces almost in the hedgerow ahead and their feet to the road. Hutchinson's radio men had similarly gone to the prone, to his right, and he shouted into his radios, directing an M60 team to fire back down the road the way they'd just come, and for everyone else to watch the brush along the road, fire low, wait till you got a target and fire low. Lieutenant Labouty, down beside the captain, sighted his commandeered M16 first on one NVA he could see darting through the brush and then on another. He couldn't tell if his rounds were striking home. The NVA were trying to get within hand grenade range. They did. Labouty saw a Chicom land near the CP, and he turned away as the explosion slapped shrapnel into his left shoulder and right knee. It burned terribly, and he cut his pack off to relieve the pressure on his wounded shoulder. But it was also a tremendous catharsis. "Oh shit, that's all there is? Here I've been tensed up all day and now I finally get wounded and it's okay, I'm walking and talking." The NVA had seen the radio antennas marking the CP's hunkered-down huddle. More grenades were flipped over the hedgerow at them, when suddenly, like an apparition, an NVA stood up on the trail. "Just appeared," thought a stunned Hutchinson. This was the first gook he'd seen all goddamn day. The NVA fired his AK-47 into the command group, hitting the 2 radio men lying between Hutchinson and the NVA, and was the NVA spin and crumple on the road, bush hat flying off, his rifle slung around his arm and staying with him during the fall. "Corpsman! Corpsman up!" One of the radio men had a sucking chest wound, but the other was awake enough to look at Hutchinson and implore, "Skipper, am I going to die?" His elbow was a mess, red and white and bone shattered, but his flak jacket looked intact, so Hutchinson assured the kid he'd be all right as the corpsman made it up to them. The corpsman, a skinny, mustached kid, sported a number of superficial wounds himself, but he never lost his cool. Moving first to the elbow-shot kid, it turned out the man's flak jacket had been riddled. And in minutes both radio men were dead in the ditch. The corpsman, his face a stoic mask, bounded on as Hutchinson got on the radio again, reporting that he had too many casualties to move and begging for fire support. "Look, you guys got to do something for me. There's another battalion on the way." But there was no abundance of fire support, and grenades continued to plop down around them. Young Marines, as cool as could be, played tit for tat, lobbing their own grenades a mere 5 meters into the brush where they could hear the NVA moving. "Oh God," Hutchinson almost screamed as he watched the first volley of outgoing grenades. "Our own guys are going to blow us up." But as he ate dirt at the 2 close explosions, he could hear the gooks squawking and squawking in pain. Nearby, PFC Horning was giving his M79 a workout, until almost out of ammunition, and PFC Mesa blasted away with his M16, making sure no NVA got across the scared out of his mind, almost shaking, turned his attention away from the road to check on the wounded lieutenant there, he didn't know, Labudi, and another anonymous wounded man. Then he glanced back up right at the sight of a grenade coming directly at his face. Cursing himself for not watching the road better, he sprang away and landed on the other side of the prone and wounded Labudi. He curled up, but his elbows were exposed, and when the Chi-Com exploded, only 8 feet away, shrapnel ripped into them. Mesa had been in country less than 3 months, but he'd been wounded before. That time he'd screamed a lot, mostly from the fear. Now he just lay there and groaned. Lieutenant Labudi was moaning a bit too. The grenade had sent slivers and chunks of metal into his right arm and right butt cheek. It would have gotten worse as dusk slid into night, if not for the arrival of the 3D Battalion, 9th Marines. Everyone's spirits soared as they saw the sky fill with helicopters to the south. They watched them disappear behind the tree lines defining the northern edge of the strip, then saw green figures emerging in columns from those tree lines headed in their direction. The NVA fire slackened, and when it seemed to have ceased, Charlie Company got to its collective feet, rolled their dead and seriously wounded, about 5 and 25 respectively, into ponchos, and began heading south again. There were dud chickens on the road, and as they passed the NVA that had been shot dead on the trail, Hutchinson reached down for the man's AK-47 and slung it over his own shoulder. The hedgerows a bit farther south were broken. It was easier to see into the fields, but the brush was still burning and smoking as it had been on Charlie Company's way in. The smoke hung languidly in the muggy dusk air, and it was here that the NVA lobbed something of a final round on them. It sounded like it came from a captured M79 grenade launcher, and Labudi was hit for the 3rd time. This time the shrapnel lodged in his left hip, so he jumped off the road. He landed on the back of another Marine who'd also sought cover in the roadside depression, realizing the man was actually Captain Hutchinson even before the startled skipper blurted, "What's going on?" "It's Labudi, sir." Captain Hutchinson twisted around, then grimaced, "Oh Jesus, are you hit again?" By the late afternoon of Sunday, July 2, 1967, the leading rumors in the 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, 3D Marine Division, were that they had encountered not NVA, but Red Chinese, and that the battalion had been so shredded as to set in motion their withdrawal to Okinawa, Japan, for complete refitting and recuperation. They nicknamed the battle the Marketplace Massacre.